Goldman Sachs did a PowerPoint about the 10 things India needs to do to achieve its 2050 potential. And one of the things was education. And I've identified education as the most important issue moving forward to India as a BRICS nation. So I'm now going to take a look at the problem and an analysis of the possible solutions. Okay, so we're going to start with a very simple pro-con analysis. So the main pro would be Indian students are a lot more willing to learn than certain demographics in the US who feel like they don't really need an education to pursue their careers, or they're satisfied with the vocational school, etc. However, in India, it's very much a more college-focused, college preparatory focus in primary education, and then higher education is more of a necessity than it is here. So that should really be viewed as a pro. However, there's a lot of cons, not to balance out one pro. Anyway, their positions in universities are reserved for scheduled castes, because the caste system has now been abolished in India, but there remains this idea that people who used to be in the lower castes have spots that are reserved for them at schools. And now there's this issue that teachers are government employees, therefore they have tenure. So public schooling in India is not where it needs to be, especially in rural India. That's the worst, because a teacher who doesn't show up for class, is not really in a situation where they're going to be penalized for it. And so that clearly needs to be changed. So, scheduled education. Let's take a look and juxtapose this to a US perspective for a second. In the US, let's say Harvard is now making its admission decisions, which it is. Now, let's say somebody, like the government, told them, okay, we need you to admit the most ghetto-fine students you can possibly find. We want them as, from like the lowest, poorest school districts. We don't care what their test scores are like, but you have to admit enough of them to make 15% of your class certified hood fab. What's Harvard going to say to that? Absolutely not. However, this is the exact situation in India. I mean, permit me my little, juxtaposed joke, but at the same time, it's a very serious issue. So what India has is, they had this caste system, which clearly wasn't working. So when that got abolished, they needed some way to promote this solidarity and this idea that castes weren't still there, even if they weren't there in name. They needed to be abolished completely. And so they chose this system, this 15% system. And so 15% of every class in any Indian educational institution, period, is made up of these scheduled caste people who are no longer of that caste, but that's, their background. And so that should probably be changed, or at the very least, it should be modified so that the education that they receive is better, and they're better prepared to move on in the system. Okay, now, again, I want to touch on this idea of the teachers having tenure. It's a system that really doesn't work. It's just not the way you would want to run an institution. You can't possibly give a teacher tenure, not supervise them, and tell them, you're going to get paid and you're going to get the same benefits regardless of what you do your actions. Basic human nature would dictate at that point that they're going to slack off. And that is exactly what they've been doing. So, there's a lot of different ways you could attack that problem. Some of them are, fraught with controversy, but others, are more solid. And so we'll get to that in my analysis. Okay, now we're going to deal with the problem of higher education. So, higher education in India is good compared to a lot of places in the world, but the fact of the matter remains, the US still has better higher education than really anywhere else in the world. US and Europe are where you go for higher education. And a lot of Indian people know that, so they choose to finish, their primary education in India, but then they become Indian expatriates, you know, some living in the US or in some cases in Europe, but mostly the US. And the problem with that is, you know, once you've gone and received a US higher education in a US university, odds are you're going to be tempted to stay in the foreign country where you went. And India isn't really going to solve the rest of the problems identified in this BRIC report without solid internal help from native Indians. So when all of your talent is just getting shipped overseas, clearly that's not what you want to do. So India needs to go and make its higher education more of a priority. I mean, also, obviously, you can't build higher floors, you know, without foundation. So, in the same sense, they should probably fix their primary education first, but simultaneously, they need this higher education fix. Okay. So now, we're going to take a look at the possible solutions. So, the solution that I also talked about in our discussion on India was this idea of a hierarchy. And again, there are pros and cons to this hierarchy. If you decide that tenure for teachers, needs to be the system that remains and prevails, but you're going to supervise them, clearly your supervisor can be corrupt. So that's going to be an issue. So that makes this look just not like the way we need to go at it. So we have to take a different look, other than this basic hierarchy. There needs to be probably no more tenure for primary teachers in India, because that's not a safe situation. You need to be able to be fired if you're not performing, which is exactly the way it works in the rest of the world. So how it doesn't work like that in India, why they decided on a system like that, I don't know, but it is evidenced it isn't working. So once we destroy this idea of tenure for primary school teachers and can get educated teachers who are willing to come to class and teach the students and make that fix, then primary education will improve, which would allow them to move on, which would allow more students to move on to secondary education, which, if more students are moving on, some of them can go overseas, some of them will then stay in India, do higher education in India, and then India would have its own talented, homegrown generation to fix its problems. And so really, I think that would be the best solution moving forward. Okay. Thank you.